Our speakers for today are Sarah Redford and Andrea Welch from the state of Wisconsin. Sarah, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your project.
All right, thank you, Jordan, so much. Again, my name is Sarah Redford. I'm the section chief for the Enterprise IT Sourcing Group here in the Bureau of Procurement at DOA in the state of Wisconsin. I'm super fortunate to have a team of very highly skilled senior-level professionals that do a lot of negotiation in the areas of IT hardware, software, services, and printing, so really running the gamut here in this group. And they've all contributed a lot of their knowledge and expertise into making this class a success. So I'm here to speak, but certainly not one of the only ones that contributed to this effort. So hello, everyone.
Hi, I'm Andrea Welch. I am an IT acquisitions consultant administrator, some god-awful bureaucratic title. Well, it is. Okay. But basically, it is negotiations that I do, a lot of with the software licensing and primarily for our state's data centers. So that runs the gamut from hardware, software, servers, mainframe, and those of you that have ever dealt with the mainframe know what kind of fun I'm talking about there. So with that, I think we will jump in. Sort of you have the PowerPoint that talks about the agenda. We're going to tell you how we discovered we had a problem, the solution that we found, and then to sort of talk about the high-level concepts that we discuss in our training, a little bit about the exercises that we do, and then we'll wrap up. So keep in mind we're sort of telling you what our class is about, though we will get into some of the points that we want to drive home and the really parts that we emphasize throughout the training. So a little background here. Like most of your organizations, we do have training for our procurement managers that takes everybody through the procurement life cycle, and our curriculum, you know, talks about statutory references, the nuts and bolts of an RFB versus an RFP, and then into contract management. So we're feeling pretty fancy about that, but as we progressed through our training, we got a lot of commentary back from our students, and certainly as we switched instructors during turnover for staff, kind of figured out that we had a really large gap in between the procurement and the solicitation itself and the contract management. It was somehow that magically you went from an award to managing a contract on a daily basis. So what we decided to do was add to our training curriculum and to try and address the gap between our assumption of what was going on and the content of what we were teaching. So a learning gap, or as I like to call that, the ball of confusion right in between there. So what we also learned, and this was, I think, more of a startling aha for us, and I think it comes down to the fact that we are the oversight organization for procurement within Wisconsin, so it didn't really occur to us that somebody might not know that they could or should negotiate. Not a good surprise, but that's okay. We also learned that contrary to most everybody in the Bureau of Procurement who really likes negotiating and really enjoys saying no, not everybody was comfortable with that. So again, our response to the problem was to develop a training course that can address what we can and can't negotiate specifically from the public sector perspective, not trying to confuse it with what the private sector is able to do. We wanted to make sure that we provided examples and the theory and the practice behind negotiation. And like all of our other classes, the feedback that we get is the more real-life examples we provide, the better off. And since we've all been doing this, I'm coming close to 2 decades on this. I've got 1 or 2 horror stories, so that's always entertaining for the class. So part of also what we wanted to do was to make sure that we provided tools for those that are sort of more timid or are not natural negotiators or who don't feel confident enough to do that. We wanted to give them options so that they could move forward. We also wanted to provide different scenarios and different tools for our folks that focus solely on price. Well, price is really important. It is not always the best value, so we wanted to be able to teach from that perspective as well. So what we have done is a one-day course that is a mix of traditional lecture. We do team teaching on this. Some of you know Seattle Gilbert, who presented with Sarah on the playbook, is my co-teacher on that. Though the original class was Sarah and I doing that, but now that she's got management duties, we've switched that out. We divide the class into 3 stages, similar to what a negotiation is: the planning, you're at the table, and then closing. And what we want to do through the class, and we attempt to do, is to talk about the when, the why, and the how of negotiation, and really stress that it's a team effort. This is not a solo activity, though certainly if you've got a $100 pieces parts thing that you're buying and you need to negotiate the delivery, that's something can be done solo and on the phone, but certainly not without the involvement of your program area. So, also what we do is we talk a lot about the roles of the parties involved, and that's the program area, that's the end user, that's management, that's executive management, depending on the size of the deal. And we really emphasize understanding the viewpoints of everybody involved. The procurement manager is project manager. We are frequently counselor to people, trying to balance needs and wants and desires and interests, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. What we say repeatedly throughout the class, and it's our mantra, and actually I want to credit appropriately to a gentleman named Joe Auer, who is, that's A-U-E-R, head of an organization called ICN, of which I'm a big fan, and they do nothing but IT procurement training. So not to take away from Value Point or NASPO, but I'm not plugging another organization. But anyway, Joe frequently repeats, and he couldn't be more accurate, that if it's not in the contract, it is not in the deal. And part of negotiation is to make sure that you are actually and accurately capturing what needs to be in the deal and what is said by the vendor. So my favorite question from the class, and since you all can't talk back to me, I can't actually ask it, is to ask when negotiation starts. And we've been doing the class now for several years, and no one has actually come up with what we believe is the right answer. And that is, a negotiation starts the moment the first person has contact with the vendor. And we've all been doing procurement long enough to know that it's usually not us. It's likely to be somebody in the program area who had an idea and thought they would check it out. And it's important to note that the moment you talk to a vendor, anyone does, they're starting a file on you, and they are going to start planning their negotiation with you at all levels. So, no surprise, vendors are going to try and get information from everyone in your organization. That is from the receptionist all the way up to the secretary or elected officials. And they are going to use all this information during the negotiation. We want to encourage you to make sure your staff that's involved in your procurement stop talking to the vendor while the procurement is going on, and that the negotiation, and while the negotiation is going on. It's a big ask, but it is worth the effort. Usually it'll take something going horribly wrong before somebody really understands the benefit of not talking, but that is for another day. So what have we got next? We jump into, in the class, of talking about bargaining strength and how, especially for the public sector, it really depends on the situation. So certainly at contract development, this is right after you finished your solicitation and issued an intent to award, you have the most leverage because at this point they don't have your money. At contract renewal, you certainly have some ability there to exercise some leverage. However, if the vendor knows you can't walk away from the deal, your leverage is diminished. So this is why we encourage you at renewal time in planning your negotiation to really research what your options are, really discuss with your program area what they can and cannot live with. This is where you have to be counselor sometimes to help them understand that they may not get to keep everything they wanted. And then when you get to contract review, that's when something's gone horribly wrong. If it's gone wrong and the vendor's completely and totally at fault and you are not at fault, you've got some leverage. But we like to encourage our procurement managers, to really talk to the program area and understand what has gone wrong before you go charging after the vendor. To say that something hasn't been done, I wish I could say it's never happened, but sometimes you don't have the full story and the vendor then enlightens you and you lose a little more leverage there. Now, so I will now turn it over to Sarah.
So she turns it over to me at this slide because I'm a big fan of acronyms. And so one of the first acronyms that we introduce when we're talking about, forming a team and you're in kind of the planning stages of a negotiation event is to take the team approach, T meaning the technical or program staff, the folks that are going to be the true stakeholders, I'll say, the ins and outs, day in, day out users of the contract. They're going to be the experts on technical needs and industry knowledge. So in our case, we rely heavily on those who actually work at the data center and work in DET to be our technical experts. I could read a technical manual about a piece of software. I could read all the Gartner research in the world. I will never be a technical expert. That's not my role. We tend to fall, and our staff in the Bureau of Procurement fall into the E in team, and that's an expert on procurement and purchasing. We're there to provide them with solutions to get them where they want to go in a defensible and legal manner, making sure that even though a live negotiation event, certainly there's a lot that you can be flexible with, but we're kind of we try to be the bedrock for that team to say, okay, now we've gone over the line, or we've broached an issue and we're not prepared to deal with it. And ideally, this person is going to not only be expert in what's required by policy, procurement law, and process, but also be a little bit more fine-tuned in their professional negotiation skills. It's not to say that other members of the team don't also have those kinds of skills, and actually we talk a little bit about balancing bargaining styles in our class as well, no matter what role you play. But we have tailored this class to help the purchasing professional and be looked at from the viewpoint of the purchasing professional to gain those skills. A is an attorney or our legal counsel, here to protect us for very obvious areas, protecting contract legality, limiting our liability and our overall risk. Sometimes we'll actually have risk management be, a subject matter expert that we call upon during negotiation if we're dealing with really, difficult issues. But certainly having legal counsel either be there as an ad hoc counsel or being a part of the team that goes in to meet with the vendor or advise us. We definitely tell our folks to have good friendships, good relationships with legal. And then the M is the management of the program, and we talk a little bit about this later on in the class as well, is making sure that you're getting buy-in at the very highest level. What are our overall goals out of this contract? And what are our make or break points as far as this being a success or this being a failure? And making sure that they understand what their role is in the process. Again, they might be coming to the meetings, or they might be ones that we call upon when something's not going great during the negotiation process, bringing in management, but always having their buy-in and always having them know, what we're going to be abiding by during the terms or during the process of negotiating. We have a question from Richard, and what goes into your decision to have an attorney at the table? I think it's really situational. Many times it's the overall size of the deal and the risk of the deal. If it's connected to like a political initiative or a large state program, we'll have an attorney definitely be dedicated or assigned to our team. Some of it is also personal preference. If the person doesn't want to be necessarily there live during those events, they just want to observe, or they want to be called upon when we feel like we need to have them there, we'll defer to that. Some of it is also workload. So we share a team of legal counsel here in our department, and so we know that we're not their only customer. So we try to bring them in and have them assigned or dedicated to really high-profile, high-level procurement activities, and then they almost serve more in an ad hoc or consult capacity for smaller deals.
We also, if the vendor is bringing in an attorney, we bring in an attorney. Mm-hmm. We let our class know that if you are bringing our legal or your legal counsel with you, it is the right thing to do to let the vendor know that you are doing that. Attorneys do not like to be surprised. Mm-hmm. So it's a little professional courtesy that we encourage.
Yep. Good question. Okay, so once you've established your team, we ask folks to start thinking about some common questions, determining first who speaks for the team and who gets to make final decisions. So typically, this is not the same person, I'll say. The one who's speaking for the team, we also don't want to be necessarily the one who's responsible for taking notes. This is a logistical issue. The one that's speaking for the team is really the one that is the one voice for the state agency in this case. We don't want that person to also have other responsibilities that's going to take their focus away from the dynamics of a live negotiation. Who makes the decisions? Normally, this is why you have management, at least understanding who your management decision makers are for that contract, so you can have touch points with them, go back to them when you know that you need to check in and make sure that you are authorized to say what you're saying, but you might still be that voice at the table with the vendor. It wouldn't necessarily be the level, that management stakeholder. Who will take notes and report on all activities? Typically, we'll work with the team and talk through, who's more comfortable doing less speaking, who would like to be there and observe kind of the mannerisms or the goings-on of the meetings and can document some of the, the decisions that are made or sticking points or questions that are asked. Again, we don't want that to be the same person who's speaking for the team typically. And then who will decide to, during a live negotiation session, decide whether or not a break is needed, the team needs to caucus, walk away in certain instances, cancel meetings. We're big fans of requiring that any live meeting, and this is, it's something that we have to consider for our resources, but also for serving the vendor's resources. We don't want to have a meeting just because it's on the books. Typically, we will say to a supplier, this is what we need from you in advance of the meeting and how early we need it. And if you can't provide these deliverables with enough time for us to review them before a negotiation meeting, we will go ahead and cancel that. Many times, sending something that's very complicated or sending back a red line or a counter cost proposal 10 minutes before we're scheduled to meet live and discuss whether or not we'll accept it, we don't allow that. We need time. That's the responsible, we think, approach to a structured negotiation. So if we are scheduled to meet and we don't have those deliverables up front, normally we will cancel. However, we want the person that's typically speaking for the team to be the one that actually tells the vendor that. So the how to negotiate, this is, you're getting a sense kind of visually of how we break up the day. During planning is when we go through our approaches and our resources. We talk about team building. We also have all of the attendees go through a bargaining style assessment that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Then the how is just talking about tips and tricks while they're at the table. Usually these are communication strategies and that, and then closing. This just breaks up the life cycle of the class. So I would say in addition to teamwork, one of the things that we emphasize in the course is constant preparation, data gathering, and planning. If you are not doing good planning, you are planning to fail in a negotiation event, certainly. One of the things that we try to stress to our folks as much as we can is not take a casual approach to this. These need to be data-driven. You need to do your research because rest assured, we understand that vendors are doing a lot of that in advance of this, and so we definitely push folks to be well prepared before they even jump into this. That said, the complexity of a negotiation will ultimately determine how much resources and the kind of approach you allocate to that given event. And so we have another acronym that we like to use, and it's called GAIN. The G in GAIN is all about gathering information on the other party or multiple parties. This is typically your public internet research. You can go to trade publications and magazines to learn, setting up Google alerts for certain suppliers if you know that's who you're going to be dealing with, so you can kind of monitor and track if there are mergers or acquisitions that might affect the discussions, how well they're doing financially, other customers in public sector that they recently have contract awards with that might have an impact on the dynamics of your discussion. So just general gathering of information. Then we go to A, assessing your team's strengths and styles. This is where we ask folks to have a real candid conversation with the team to say who's comfortable doing what under certain circumstances. Again, we've alluded to this in the very beginning. Not all purchasing agents are very comfortable being lead negotiators. We talked through that. I being identifying parties' interests and positions that you might run into during the negotiation, and N standing for naming your best alternative to a negotiated agreement or a BATNA. We'll talk about that in a bit. A walk-away position, any trade-offs or small chips, and then strategy among your team, when to employ what strategies at what points in the process. So we went through a little bit of this already, but gathering information, these are just a lot of resources that we recommend the attendees of the class utilize whenever they're applicable to make sure that you're not surprised by information that comes in to the process during the negotiation, and just that you know the party on the other side of the table. This is not about, gathering something that creates an adversarial situation necessarily, but just being educated about who you're dealing with. Assuming, of course, that your preparation efforts are being doubled by the other party. We see this on a regular basis during demonstrations at RFPs. Many suppliers, especially those that compete for a lot of our enterprise contracts, are very well trained in negotiation. And so this class is our attempt to try and get our purchasing agents to a similar level by way of negotiation skill and experience. A being assessing your team's strengths and styles. So what we utilize, we don't want to take credit for this at all. It's not our work. G. Richard Schell's book, Bargaining for Advantage, Negotiation Strategies for Reasonable People, contains a negotiation and bargaining style assessment that's available online. And so we use that in our exercise in the morning of this class. So people answer certain questions from Mr. Schell's book and his exercise to determine what kind of a negotiator are they? What's their typical approach? What's most natural to them and their personality? Then the class discusses individual results of that bargaining style assessment, and we ask them to keep those results in mind when they assign team roles for the mock exercise later on in the afternoon. And we'll talk about that later in the webinar today as well, but what we tried to do in creating this hypothetical exercise is write up named roles for fictional people that have the types of bargaining styles that are contained in this assessment. So people can map. If I'm a competitor, I might want to consider being the role of this competitive person in the mock negotiation, etc.
One of the things that we find really interesting as the longer we teach this class is a lot of the students are choosing roles in the mock exercise that are absolutely the opposite of what they have found themselves to be, to try and stretch themselves, and I think that has produced some really interesting results.
Absolutely. So this is a summary of the main styles, the 5 styles that are contained in that assessment, and what we ask folks to go through. So in our class, we go over these and talk about the various styles in the frame of having a pot of gold and how each of these bargainers would approach the distribution of that pot of gold with a team. So an avoider who dislikes conflict might say something to the effect of, well, just take this pot of gold, because they'd rather give the other person what they want than deal with conflict over the value that needs to be shared. Versus a compromiser who wants to focus on what's fair and maintaining that personal relationship with the other party is going to look at ways to kind of split the difference, I guess, and look at what's truly fair for both of them, because they care more about the relationship than the value of that pot of gold, so to speak. An accommodator is going to focus on solving the other person's problem over their own problem. So not entirely like the avoider who just wants nothing to do with the exercise altogether, but an accommodator is going to typically defer because they would rather not deal with the discomfort of, again, the conflict. A collaborator will seek to find underlying problems and engage the other party in creative solutions to figure out how, again, they can split that pot of gold to the best, the best gain of each party. And then the competitor, whose sole focus is winning, will typically say, I'm going to go ahead and take that pot of gold and walk away now. So it's kind of our way of adding some humor, but also illustrating how these different bargaining styles are portrayed in people. The ideal team, and this is what we like to teach, will not only include representatives from your primary stakeholders and be cross-functional, but will also include a mix of different personal styles, meaning how someone approaches bargaining overall. So when we get into the identification of both parties' objectives and interests, this is where we're very clear what we're looking for. The state in a procurement event, our interest is a competitive price for the quality product or service while mitigating our risk representing the taxpayers. It's the best deal, the six rights of procurement: right time, right place, right price, right specs, etc. And typical interest of vendors, in many cases, is to make as much money as possible from a contract. We're representing taxpayers. We want to spend as little as we can to get great value, and we understand that our suppliers are not charitable organizations. They're looking to get as much money out of the deal as possible. Recognizing that is just a naturally conflicting position to be in, but it should be, recognized as that going in. Another interest typically of a vendor is to avoid risk for their own company, any unnecessary exposure or cost to dealing with you as a customer under contract, to get a commitment or a long-term relationship, to start being able to refer to the state as a partner in many cases.
Oh, God.
I know. But that's typically going to be a common goal of a supplier. And then any reputation. We use the term prestige, which is kind of interesting, and recognition. So this typically will come in if it's a new company and they're brand new to public sector space, and they want to be able to claim the state of Wisconsin as a client or a state agency as a client. That's something that might be, maybe a smaller goal for them, but one nonetheless that we've seen in our experience. And then the N in naming your bargaining essentials. This is all about just planning and documenting your plan. It's one thing to talk with a team verbally in a meeting to say this is what we're trying to get out of a deal or out of a contract. It's another thing to document that and make sure that you can relate back to that documentation as a team as things change over time, to remind yourselves of why you're all there. What's the common goal? The performance and price targets that you ultimately want to get to at the end of this process. This is where you're going to also name your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, your walkaway, or what we call a reservation price, where basically this is the top of the line. This is where we can't go $1 over this amount. You're going to want to talk through that with your team. The communication strategy, going back to Andrea's earlier point about context with the vendor. When we're in an active negotiation, we certainly want to make sure that our strategy is one voice for the team, unless that one voice designates another team member to speak on their behalf. We understand that answer shopping is an element that we're going to have to deal with when we're dealing with certain suppliers, and so we want the team to at least understand that our strategy is a little bit more formal than that. We want that central point of contact. Preparing your team for the possibility of walking away or the potential for no agreement. This is something that we reinforce to folks, and sometimes we get a raised eyebrow. What do you mean it's possible we might not get a contract? Well, we don't always come around to an agreement. And so this is something that we tell folks to prepare their teams for, or for a lot of delay in getting the contract done if a point or a price is very important to you. And then dealing with any internal conflicts of positions or interests. So many parts of state government have different interests. We have different missions. Our IT department is focused on supporting the IT infrastructure and providing core services to state agencies. We are focused on getting a good deal, following the proper process, and sometimes that means we might have different interests with our internal stakeholders, but just want to be able to obviously manage those before those conflicts become apparent to the vendor that we're dealing with. We have another question that came in. Maybe you'll cover this, but what role does market research play in identifying the vendor's interests? You want to take that?
A key role, and in fact, the moment that you are aware of you're doing a procurement or entering into a negotiation, we highly recommend you set up Google alerts for everybody involved, and you start watching all of the potential vendors as early as possible, so that by the time you get to the intent to award, you've got your own profile sort of built on the players. You certainly want to check out what other states are doing business with which vendors. Your incumbents and other vendors are more than happy to rat out each other and give you all sorts of inside information that will allow you to research on that a little bit more. So I think it's invaluable.
I totally agree. And one of the things that we do sometimes as a resource, we do call up Gartner on occasion or call upon their research in the IT space, but for just general market research, I'm looking at other states' contracts, I'm looking at NASPO pricing to come up with my targets at the time that I'm developing my solicitation. Because once we get through an evaluation and we're ready to make an award, a lot of these steps that we've talked about as far as building a team and getting ready to reach out to the vendor, those things happen at a really quick clip. And certainly our customers want them to happen quickly. It takes a while even to get through an evaluation, so once that award is ready, we have at least found with our customers, they're ready to go. They want to get through a negotiation process, get that contract signed so they can start working with the supplier. So a lot of times and I recommend to the folks in this class as well that take it, to start doing that market research as early as they can so they're ready to respond to their customers' needs and work within kind of those timelines.
Right. And the more you do this, and I can really only speak to the IT portion of it, is just keeping abreast of what's going on in the industry that you're focusing on. And I frequently, if I read an article about a particular technology that sounds like it could be coming, I call them my guys, my tech guys, that I've been working with for a long time, and I will just shoot them an email and say, tell me about this. Is this something that you could be looking at? We really, we're not always successful, but we do like to teach and encourage people to be as involved with the program area as early as possible. In a perfect world, we're their first call. I want to be called the moment they think they might kind of sort of like to buy something, so that we can be prepared ahead of time. Okay, so we've done a lot of planning, and now we're at the table. We're going to talk a little bit about the give and take, and when we say start by identifying the trade-offs, this is something that we hope you will have done with your internal team. You're not going to sit down with the vendor and go, here's everything we have to trade. It should be done very strategically. We like to have the vendor start first. I want them to offer something, either offer something or threaten something, as they sometimes do. But if they're not moving, we want to propose that we're willing to give up something, perhaps small, but never without something in exchange. Don't ever give without getting. So there is an element of fairness that you want to enforce there. Definitely you want to resist the urge to give them all of your small cards first. You need to hold on to something. My personal favorite, and you're going to develop your own favorites of things that you'll hold on to. Personally, I don't believe that the most favored nations clause ever truly works in the way that we want it to, because somehow, miraculously, the vendor never does a deal the same way with anybody else for less money. I also know that vendors absolutely hate that clause, and their accountants really hate that clause, because if there's a potential of money still on the table, there's a problem with revenue recognition, and we could do a whole class on revenue recognition, but that's another day. So I am willing to give up most favored nations clause at the drop of a hat, but I will hold on to it as long as I can to get exactly what I want. So we encourage you to frame your options rather than just offering one solution of take it or leave it. People like to have choices, so if you have several ways to get to an end result that you want about pricing, or for instance, they don't want to give you a greater discount because you don't have the volume yet, but you're pretty sure you'll get the volume. Put a timetable around it and say, okay, you know what, we'll accept, not as much of a discount as we want, but how about if after 6 months we hit a particular threshold, you'll give us the discount that we wanted. It's just a way of looking at how to get where you want to go. And most important about a negotiation, it's a conversation. Everybody has a role to play, and yes, in a sense, it's an adversarial relationship, but you have very different goals, and I think you have to really go into it with a level of respect for the other side. It's not like they're taking it personally, and you shouldn't take it personally, because that would assume they actually care more about you personally than they do, and that's not really the case. So we do talk about, we'll get to anchoring later, but you want to talk about positions and interest. Okay, so a position is the what. It reflects what you want, not necessarily what you need. So, for instance, you want a 50% discount, but the reason you want it is because you need to stay under budget. The vendor only wants to give you a 10% discount, and the reason they only want to give you 10% is because they want to get their budget numbers up. So can you come up with a compromise between your position and your interest and their position and their interest? We have hammered communication, I think perhaps to death, but I think one more time. It is absolutely critical that you communicate within your group. It is communicate to the vendor in a very clear and principled way. You want to be open and compromise where you are able to, but you should never share information just because they ask. It is something that you give away strategically and when it is in your best interest, assuming, of course, you're not breaking any of your open records laws or disclosure laws. So we've talked about that. Now we've talked about all of that, I think. I need to keep going there. So part of the takeaways that we want the class to leave with about being at the table is you want to listen for valuable information and their positions, really understand why they're asking, what they're asking for. You want to watch for nonverbal cues that yield information. This is the point in the class where you see Sarah and I or Seatra and I show all sorts of facial expressions or, you know, sitting with your arms crossed, things like that that actually mean something, and watching for that. I'm going to just jump down to the last bullet there. We all have habits, physical habits, that we're all not really aware of. So this is a good time, before you get to the table to figure out who's got what habits. Some people are head shakers. They just, you know, they agree and they're nodding their head, yes, we understand. And the vendor is reading that as they've got agreement. And that you have to learn to control that. By the same token, you have to watch what the vendor's doing. Are they crossing their arms? Are they tapping the table? That sort of thing. We talk about timing breaks and transitions in meetings to your advantage. You can get down to the level of having beverages in the room or withholding beverages in the room, the temperature of the room. All sorts of things can go into this, and it's really going to depend on the size of the deal. If you are meeting in a vendor's facility, and they will absolutely do that to you. Eye contact is critical. If you are not paying attention and maintaining eye contact, they are, in a sense, winning, or they think they are. The other thing, contrary to what this whole presentation is, silence is a good thing. We like to say that you should never miss an opportunity to shut up because the longer you can be quiet, the more you're going to learn about the vendor. And besides, it's incredibly unsettling to the vendor if you don't talk. And it's entertaining as well. So we get into price anchoring, which for those that aren't familiar is overly relying on a specific piece of information, like the suggested manufacturer's price. That's an anchor. It's setting a level of expectation for the price. So once an anchor is set, undoing the bias towards something else is harder to do. As we just said, a common pricing anchor is the MSRP. You want to be able to combat that information with research and data. This is where knowing who's paying what price in what situations in other deals is very, very helpful. In the give and take on anchoring, especially on the price, this is obviously logical. The first price offered is that generally the anchor. If you need to get a lower price, I would say that you want to be anchoring first. When you have the information and the research, you can combat this very easily. If you don't have adequate information, let them draw the line, but be ready to come up to speed with the research right after that. And never, ever take the first offer. I think that should be apparent, but I guess we have to say it. You know, they come to the table with room to move, and we have to know that and take advantage of that. So. Okay, so ways to achieve a successful agreement. We talked about the interests and the positions. You want to develop broad and creative options for mutual gain. As I said, you each have something to come away with, and it is not the worst thing in the world for them to actually get part of what they need as long as you are getting what you need. You want to make decisions easy for them. This goes back to our talking about setting options for them to get the discount you want to allow them to get their revenue. And that you want to listen more than you talk. Definitely take your emotions out of it. That is difficult frequently. You're dealing with other human beings, and sometimes you like them and sometimes you don't. And you certainly want to decide on mutually agreeable standards that you're going to use for data on that. So I'll use, in the mainframe world, we like to use a company called Cheryl Watson, and that has to do with CPU ratings and all this. We like it better than Gartner. Some vendors like Gartner, and if we have to agree that Gartner is going to be the basis of our MSU or MIPS ratings, we do that, but you want to get that set at the beginning because sometimes different rating services are very different, or different data sources can be very different. So obviously pick one that's to your advantage. So, that is certainly what they're looking at. And how many times have you done a deal where the number or the dollar amount that the vendor is going to get doesn't seem to change, but everything else that goes into that number can change? Sometimes you end up with additional training that you didn't know that you needed, or things like that, or additional product. They like to do that sort of thing. If you can buy additional or include additional product in the deal, you're essentially getting it for free. This is where I'm doing air quotes. Nothing, of course, is free. But definitely keep that in mind. Always use ethical strategies to get your desired result. And certainly be on the lookout for unethical tactics and different closing techniques. And that I don't see necessarily on a daily basis unethical behavior, but certainly sometimes questionable from the vendor. So. And my favorite topic in all of this is ethical boundaries. Lying about facts is bad. You just don't lie. Don't lie, don't lie, don't ever lie. It is not worth it. When especially you're negotiating with a party that you're going to deal with in the future. I can't speak to every other industry, but certainly in IT, there are sales reps that I have worked with now for 15 years who have been at 15 different software companies. They're not going away. And certainly in the public sector, you know, deceptive practices are going to damage your reputation. And let's be honest here, we don't get paid by the size of the deal that we do. Our life doesn't change dramatically like a vendor's does, who gets a huge bonus. So all that we have in bringing to the table personally as negotiators and procurement managers are our reputation. So why would you damage your reputation by doing anything unethical? And I would just like to say, in terms of, we talk about win-win and win-lose in an approach to negotiation. If you say to yourself, I am going to get this deal done this way no matter what, I would argue, and apparently psychologists will back me up on this, that you have just psychologically set yourself up to be susceptible to unethical practices. So I would just encourage you to keep that in mind.
So when you're looking at closing, you're getting to the end, what we like to at least feature in this class, which is sometimes kind of funny, is going over some of the common closing tactics that we see sometimes occur. And one joke I like to say is it's called a tactic when we see it from a supplier. It's called a strategy when we employ it. It's the direct pressure, where they just come in and say, like it's a foregone conclusion, here we are, can you just go ahead and sign this? This is typical, will come about when too much communication has happened up front with the program area that maybe you weren't aware of. And all of a sudden the vendor comes and says, basically we've gone over all these details, here you go. Presumptive means that they're assuming you won't be negotiating. They skip right to procedural issues. I brought this ready for you to sign. All you need to do is put your John Hancock on the line. And obviously, we like to say, well, hold on a second. We do have a responsibility to discuss terms and conditions that are not entirely acceptable to us. False choice is one where it's presented as one or the other. We don't normally like to agree that those are our only options. We want to visit whether there's a price in between, $20 or $50 package. I'd like the free package, please. And talking through some of the elements with the supplier as to why it has to be one or the other. Looks like we've got a question. You practice how to answer the question, what's your bottom line on price, without lying? Yes. Most of the time, it will be something to the effect of, that's immaterial at this time. That's something that we're not prepared to answer right now. We need more data. We need a better understanding of the assumptions that are built into your price in order to provide information about that. We're also big fans of countering with actual numbers. So if I've got a fair amount of detail and data supporting what I think is a fair price, I'll go ahead and redline out a price for a supplier and send it back and say, this is clearly a counter that we want you to react to. That won't be the only thing that we ask them to react to. It will usually be presented with 5 or 6 other items that we want to get as part of that overall contract. But it's still dealing in dollars and cents. So I'm not saying I can only afford to pay $10. If I know $10 is, my rock bottom price, and they're at 11, I might counter at $8.50. So it's kind of saying, that's immaterial at this time what the exact budget number is. This is what I think a fair price is. Please tell me why you don't think that's fair. I don't know if that helps. The other additional closing tactics that we've seen, the strong arm. So basically assuming that they're skipping over all those other issues. They're saying only one issue is holding up this deal, so if we agree to this, will you sign today? Ticking clock is putting a deadline on acceptance. We really balk at this. We need time to go through something that's complicated, even if it's a one-pager of terms and conditions. If they say all of the elements of this original proposal will expire unless you say yes in 48 hours, I don't accept that.
I have never seen it to be actually true.
Yeah.
A large software vendor actually brought us the same deal at quarter end 3 times, and it didn't change throughout the year. And we ended up actually bettering the deal because we waited till their fiscal year end.
Mm-hmm. Scarcity is just combining that ticking clock with an assertion that what you're buying is in limited supply. So again, unless you've done research to confirm that that's actually accurate, this is something that we typically dismiss as well. In responding to tactics, this is the general theme of our class. Be strategic about it. Stop and think. So avoid answers that might diminish your leverage. Gone over this already, but prefer not to share that data at this time, not material to the discussion. Most of the time, that's totally accurate. I like to be able to rely on something in writing that I am certain about with data and research. So if they were to ask me, what does this rule prohibit you from accepting or agreeing to, or what about your statutes don't allow you to accept this term, it is perfectly acceptable to say, I can't answer that right in the moment. I need to confer with our legal counsel. Most of these issues are more complicated than just a yes or no. So we typically advise that you strategically table discussion of those issues so you can have more time to research and decide. So at this point in the class is normally the end of the lecture component. We hand out, obviously the class was divided earlier in the day into 2 teams. They go through their bargaining style assessment. Now we give them secret folders with roles and responsibilities and situations that are all built into this mock negotiation over a computer hardware deal. And we ask each of them to do a fair amount of team caucusing. We put them in separate rooms, and then we bring them together at various points throughout the rest of the afternoon to talk through terms and conditions and try to actually go through a negotiation scenario. This exercise is what we think is the most fun part of the class. I think it's the most value add by way of the comments that we've gotten in our surveys, and something that I think allows people to go through the day not just listening to lectures go back and forth talking, but actually gives them an opportunity right then and there to practice their new skills. Looks like we have a question. Do you enter the meeting with a price predetermined that must be met or offered in order for success? What happens when market analysis isn't done in advance to show accurate prices? So at least for me, I usually go in, I at least have a plan. If the plan doesn't include the price that I need to get to yet in that first meeting, I'm deferring any discussions on price until I've gotten with my team and been able to do some additional research on what we think is fair. So normally I'll set that stage right at that outset and say, even though you might be wanting to come and talk about price, we're not prepared to do that at this time. We want to focus this meeting on terms and conditions, shipping, risk of loss, etc. When market research isn't done in advance to show accurate prices, that's a tough spot to be in, most definitely. I think at that point what I would advise, if you don't have the data or you don't have the time, is just to push back on the other elements that you know are part of that contract that are costing you money as a customer, and see if you make incremental changes. If the vendor says your price is still the same, ask why. Because if you know that it's costing them more to send someone to your site, for example, versus provide remote service, and their hourly rate doesn't change after you've conceded that they can provide everything over the phone versus actually coming to your facility and providing on-site service, it's just a logical question to ask of why that wouldn't decrease the price in some way, because they're building in travel, they're building in those costs into the price that they're providing to you. So having that be the start of a conversation, I guess. But ideally, you're in a better position than that. You're doing more research than that.
Sure. I mean, you want to approach everything like that of an if-then else. So just think about just that logical progression, and that should help you get to some better information.
So a little bit more about the mock negotiation exercise that we have at the end of the class. We have made the scenarios complex enough that they have many different issues that they can talk about across the table. So most of the focus points in the mock negotiation have to do with the price of the hardware, the warranty that the state is getting in this, shipping and risk of loss terms, software installation, and the term of the contract. That's kind of where we start. That said, this is a live mock negotiation with very little rules, other than you just can't tell the supplier everything that you know in your secret role folder. Other than that, we see the teams take these discussions to very different places that we haven't intended. A lot of times they'll bring their personal experience, their personal expertise in possible past negotiation experience to this, and come up with ideas about dynamics for the contract that we never even considered. And I think that's the element that really makes this class most fun for us, is that it's not just a learning opportunity for the students. We're learning just as much each time we do this as they are probably taking away from the class as a participant.
Absolutely. We've actually had only once in all the time we do it where they did not reach a deal. But as it turns out, every time they get to the end of the day and either they've reached a deal that they like, all the parties seem to be very happy with the outcome, which for us, when we talk about the idea that everybody should gain something out of the deal, everybody has the right to feel that it was a fair deal, that to me says we've done a good job that day if everybody walks out feeling like it was a fair experience.
So that said, we do try and do a standard debrief with the team to cover some basic questions. We asked them if they thought one or the other team had an inherent advantage or disadvantage during the exercise. If there was information that a person had at their purview that they didn't share with their team, would it have made a difference in the final outcome? If an agreement was reached, we talked about whether they feel fair or that they would be able to do this again if they had to come together again during a contract term. What would they have done differently? And then in the case of it not being reached, we asked them what they think those barriers were and what might have changed the result. Was it a lack of communication? Was it, kind of a mistake that was made or something that was said or done at the negotiating table that was a barrier? So something that we really want them to reflect on. So really what we try to do with this is provide real-life examples of what can go right and what can go wrong learning our lessons, with a special emphasis on the dynamics and the interactions that you're going to have with different suppliers. We want to treat vendors as customers, but understand also that they have very different interests than we do, and they are highly trained as well. So representing the taxpayers, we have to be ready to grapple with that. We want to rebalance the scales to understand that negotiation begins with that first interaction, and then we want to be just as engaged with that supplier all the way through the life cycle of the contract. We teach that the better we can serve our internal customers by getting involved early, we can be their first call, not their last. The better off those results are going to be at the tail end of a contract negotiation. This last slide is just a tie-in to some of the elements of the Cronin program where we felt like this class might have been a decent fit as far as approaching negotiation from an innovative perspective, wanting to transfer, of course, a lot of the content to other jurisdictions. The majority of this class is not focused on state of Wisconsin specific policy or procedure or regulations. Most of it is soft skills training and just talking through experiences and telling stories we can learn from each other. By way of service improvement, this was very much customer driven. Like Andrea had said early on, we noticed a gap, we tried to fill it with a class, and we think really people learn and have a lot of fun with this course. Cost reduction, negotiation classes can be expensive. And so one of the things that we hope that this offers to state employees that have very limited budgets is an opportunity to at least get some basic training that's custom to their position in the state of Wisconsin. And if their agency can afford to send them to additional training, they can go on from there. So that really ties up the webinar. I think we've got 2 minutes left on the clock. Jordan can correct me if I'm wrong. But please feel free to contact us with questions or enter questions in the chat box if we do have additional time. Really want to thank you all for spending an hour of your day with us. We really appreciate the opportunity.